What really happens before a market crash? What is it that triggers a downturn that goes beyond just a bubble bursting and into a full-on generation-defining financial downturn? Think about 2008, when mortgage-backed securities filled the biggest housing bubble in history when it burst. US home prices fell by as much as 40% in some markets, and millions of families lost their homes. Or go back to the Great Depression when the stock market collapse left 1 in 4 Americans out of work and bread lines stretched around city blocks. These events felt sudden at the time, but here's the truth. They weren't. Crashes don't just come out of nowhere. The fear of waking up to see your savings wiped out overnight is real. But history shows that there are always signals flashing before the crash. And if you know what to look for, you don't have to be caught off guard. That's what this video is about. Because when you trace the biggest financial collapses in history, you will see the same 4 patterns appear again and again. The names and the numbers change, the technologies change, but the psychology that hasn't changed in over 500 years. In the next few minutes, I'll walk through 4 of the biggest crashes of the past 3 centuries. Each has its own strange story, but beyond the stories, you will notice the same 4 signals. And here's why this matters. Those same 4 signals are flashing again today. Ray Dalio has been warning about them. Trump's current policies are accelerating some of them. And if history is any guide, ignoring these signals could be one of the costliest mistakes an investor could make. To see the first clear signs of what always happens before a crash, we need to step back in time all the way to the early 1800s, when Europe witnessed 2 spectacular financial meltdowns, France's Mississippi bubble and Britain's South Sea bubble. They both showed the first 2 patterns that always appear before a crash, that is, fantasy pricing and paper riches. Let's start in France. The country was drowning in debt after decades of war. Then came a banker named Law, who convinced the French government to issue paper money through a national bank. He also created the Mississippi Company, which was given a monopoly over trade and development in France's massive New World territory, Louisiana. Law and his promoters painted Louisiana as a kind of promised land. They claimed it had fertile farmland, silver and gold mines, and booming trade opportunities. The story spread like a wildfire. But here's the catch. Almost no one in France has ever been there. People had no way to fact-check the promises. All they had was John Law's story. Backed by the French crown, it was a perfect setup for speculation. Shares of the Mississippi Company soared. The national bank kept printing more paper money to fill the buying frenzy, which meant prices climbed higher. People felt richer and even more rushed in. At the peak, shares had increased more than 20 times their original value. That's put in $100 and watching it turn to $2,000 in just a month. But the reality in Louisiana was far less glamorous. It was sparsely populated, much of it swampy, difficult to farm, and there were no great gold or silver mines. The riches were mostly exaggerated rumors. Once investors realized that the dream was overblown, confidence collapsed, shares plummeted, paper money lost credibility, and fortunes were wiped out almost overnight. Law himself fled Paris. At the same time, across the English Channel, Britain was experiencing its own bubble with the South Sea Company. This company had taken on a large portion of the Britain's national debt and promised investors huge profits from trade with South America. However, the problem, Britain didn't actually have the trade rights, it was advertising. But like Louisiana's, the story was enough to ignite a frenzy. Shares of the South Sea Company soared as well, from about £100 to over $1,000 in less than a year. In today's terms, that's like a stock going from $100 to $10,000 practically overnight without any real profits behind it. Even Isaac Newton, one of the smartest men in history, got caught up in the crazy. He made money at first, sold his shares, and then, against his better judgment, jumped back in when the mania reached its peak. He ended up losing most of fortune. Later, he famously said, "I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." When the South Sea bubble collapsed, countless investors across Britain were ruined. Parliament had to scramble to contain the fallout, and trust in the financial system was shattered. So, what do these twin bubbles show us? They show us the first two patterns that always happen before a crash. Number one, fantasy pricing. When people stop asking what something is actually worth and start buying only because they believe someone else will pay more tomorrow, the market becomes a casino. That's not investing. That's gambling within a thin layer of respectability. Number two, paper riches. When wealth is built on financial instruments, promises, or even money itself that isn't backed by real value, it creates a fragile system. It looks strong in the moment, but the second confidence breaks, it all unravels. 3 centuries later, these patterns felt strikingly familiar. Because if you look at today's markets, don't we see some of the same signs? Entire industries are valued at sky-high numbers without solid profits. Paper wealth in the form of easy credit, printed money, and assets that only exist in digital form. And that's the scary part. Human psychology hasn't changed since 1720. Same forces that drove farmers, merchants, and even Isaac Newton into bubbles are alive and well today. Which brings us to the next crash to our list. One that shows how dangerous it gets when not just individuals, but entire banks and governments overstretched themselves. If the bubbles of 1720 showed us how individuals can get swept up in fantasy, the bearing crisis of 1890s showed us what happens when entire nations and the most powerful banks overstretched themselves. At the time, London was the financial capital of the world, and no institution was more prestigious than Baring Bank. Founded back in the 18th century, Barings had financed governments, founded wars, and helped build railways and canals across continents. It was called a banker's bank. Trusted by kings and prime ministers, if you wanted credibility in global finance, you wanted Baring standing behind you. But in the 1880s, Baring made a fateful decision. It went all in Argentina. Why Argentina? Because at the time, it looked like the next America. Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, was nicknamed the Paris of South America. Railways were expanding at a lightning speed, carrying grain and beef from the fertile pampas to booming ports. European immigrants were arriving by the tens of thousands, bringing skills and capital. From London, Argentina looked unstoppable, a country destined to be one of the richest in the world. British investors were captivated by the story. Argentina's bonds and infrastructure projects were sold on the London Stock Exchange like hotcakes, and Barings was the main underwriter. The bank poured millions into Argentinian debt, encouraging others to do the same. For a while, it seemed brilliant. Money flowed, new rail lines stretched across the plains, agriculture exports soared, and confidence was sky high. But then reality struck.